or phone calls. If anyone is letting you all know they're having problems, please, I will put my phone number in the chat, and you can let them know to call me, and I will work on this side to try and get folks on who are having any problems. Alexandra, if you want to go ahead and start, and Mary Lou, if you want to go ahead and hit record. Just as a reminder, we are recording this session as we voted last time. The meetings will be recorded, and we will post them on YouTube for the public to view. Great, thank you.
I have a question.
Yes.
Did you guys vote to post the subcommittee meetings on YouTube as well? Because I was going to try to attend, but they were early when I was in school, so.
Sure. Thank you for asking that. We're going to have subcommittee updates. I think that all three agreed. No, they did not. Okay. Sorry. I will let them report out on that when we get to the subcommittee reports, because I also wasn't able to fully attend all of them. So thank you for that question. I'm going to make note of that. Okay. Thanks so much. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for making time and space to be here. I think today just invites a lot of grace. So thank you, Mary Lou and Amy, for troubleshooting to get everyone in the room. I invite us all to take a breath, because I think also a moment of pause is really important for us in these times. I want to start by speaking Breonna Taylor's name today, which feels necessary for me in every space that I navigate. I don't ever want to act like what is happening does not deeply impact us and affect us, and try to carry on business as usual. And so I need to acknowledge her today, as I'm rattled to my core. It's also important for us to acknowledge the Pueblo and Navajo and Apache peoples, who are the traditional custodians of our land since time immemorial. I acknowledge the connections to the land and the significant contributions that have been made and continue to be made to the broader community statewide. And I invite all of us to acknowledge our ancestors and to invite them in this space, as their ancestral wisdom and knowledge and knowing will guide us. I think today and this past week, again, just gives us reasons for instituting an advisory council on racial justice that we have always known, and they just seem to be reinforced every single day. We learned last week from Dawn Wooten, who is a Black woman and a nurse at a privatized detention facility, that immigrant women were forcefully sterilized without their knowledge or consent. And it is a reminder of the deep historical roots that we should and may cause us to want to look deeper at our own state's relationship with these institutions, as well as the passing of Associate Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who her passing seems to unveil the fact that we have known we need to follow the lead of reproductive justice activists and what they have always told us, that we must ensure access to health care, including reproductive health care for all. As we know, Black, Indigenous, people of color are the most vulnerable. And just today, we see the killing of Breonna Taylor resulting in a charge of endangering not her, but her neighbor, and reminding us of the racial and gendered violence of police brutality that brought us to the streets at the beginning of the summer, and that we must look at these institutions and the policies that govern them in our own state. And so I am committed, and I know and believe that you all are, that the work of this council is not just timely, it's past time, and that we won't just be another task force named to pacify the call to action. I also always want to start with thanking Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham and Amy Whitfield and Shawnee Harvey, Tammy Watson, Kaylee Salazar for their support in staffing this committee and the subcommittees, and my deep, deep gratitude for each of you for continuing to serve for this commitment. Today we have two guests, and I We gave them the time slot of starting at 4:10, so I'm going to move to that. We have with us today, as we agreed upon at our last meeting, we would focus on law enforcement and really looking at setting the short-term priorities as moving anything to as we work on identifying moving other things to the longer-term priority list as we look to create racial justice action plans. And so today, at the beginning of this meeting, we have two guest presenters, Alice McCoy and Gary Housepian. Alice is with the Developmental Disabilities Planning Council, and Gary is with the Disability Rights New Mexico. And they are going to share with us an overview of their advocacy and work that they have been doing, and then we will open for questions and discussion. So Alice and Gary, I will turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Alexandria. We do have some slides to share, so I'm wondering if we could get the share function so that we can put those up. We're really envisioning this to be less of a presentation and more just a beginning of the conversation. When I talked to Amy a couple of weeks ago about how we really wanted to work with this council, we realized the importance of setting our priorities and setting the tone so that we see how much these two issues of race and disability are connected. I'm still waiting on the share function, so is that happening? We can just
see.
I'm looking at the share function. As a presenter, you should be able to share.
It just appered for me.
Okay.
I shall do that now. Thank you very, very much for the opportunity to speak with y'all today. Let me just start it. And before we jump into introductions, I wanted to share this first slide. This really captures how I feel about this intersectionality issue. And I'm quoting from Melissa Thompson. I don't know if you've heard of the hashtag Disability to Whites movement. And she was one of the leaders who brought forward the, Black Disabled Lives Matter hashtag as well. And so I really just want to read this to set the tone. An issue that I have within both Black and disability spaces is that people want you to fragment yourself. If I'm going to be in your space, I need you to see all of me instead of seeing the part of me that is similar to you. And so I'm just going to jump into introductions with Gary and me. And there we go. I'll jump in first. So my name is Allison McCoy. I'm the Executive Director of New Mexico Developmental Disabilities Planning Council. And the purpose of our organization is to advocate on behalf of Mexicans living with disabilities, specifically developmental disabilities, but really a whole range. We also house the Office of Guardianship. And there are two committees within our council, the Legal and Civil Rights Committee and the Education Committee, that deal very much with the issues that we're going to bring to your attention today. And I really hope that after you've heard from us, that we'll have an ongoing partnership and that we can have projects and other proposals that we can work on together at the state level. I really do believe that state leadership is necessary for us to deal with these issues. And I'll let Gary introduce himself.
Good afternoon. My name is Gary Housepian, and I'm the Executive Director of Disability Rights New Mexico. Just as far as background goes, I am a lawyer, and I first started in public interest work 43 years ago. And as Executive Director of Disability Rights New Mexico, two significant areas that we have worked on that I think are significant for the Advisory Council is our work with APD Forward Coalition, which involves the court settlement regarding Albuquerque police and excessive use of force. And the second area that I want to talk about is our education advocacy, which specifically will talk about disparate suspensions, expulsions of kids of color and kids of disability and share some things with you on that.
Gary. And so we have a continuing partnership as well. Gary is the chair of our Legal and Civil Rights Committee and sits on our council as the DRNM representative. So there are a few common themes I think we have to touch on before we can jump into stats or anything else. The first thing is we're going to speak on both education and law enforcement today because they're inextricably connected. You can't really separate the two, because as you're looking at racial justice issues in law enforcement, they start from childhood. They start in schools and really run the gamut throughout people's lives. And in order for us to deal with racial justice issues in law enforcement, we have to start with education. We have to start with schools. So we're going to be addressing both of those things today. I also want to talk about some of the way that we think about disability and how it touches on racial justice issues. For example, there are disabilities that touch all areas of law enforcement issues that people may or may not think about. So I think the first one that folks really do think about are behavioral and mental health disabilities. This was the crux of the consent decree, the Department of Justice settlement agreement that was put on the city of Albuquerque and the Albuquerque Police Department. It was a major part of the settlement agreement, and the person who was killed by law enforcement was a person with a mental behavioral health issue. And because of the settlement agreement, we now have specific units in law enforcement that deal specifically with these issues. Another population that is targeted are developmental disabilities, intellectual disabilities, and then a final one that folks really often don't think about is traumatic brain injury. We'll see some stats later on how some of these disabilities intersect with law enforcement. But the crucial note here is that there needs to be expertise at every level. So whenever there is our intersectionality issues that we see, we also need to have experts weighing in. You know, when we are dealing with whether it's school discipline or law enforcement interactions on the street or in prisons, or later on in after release from incarceration, at every point there needs to be expertise on these disabilities, because how we are able to deal with these disabilities really makes the biggest difference in outcome for people who are living with them. So another major theme that I think Gary can really weigh in on is poverty. Health disparities really do make a difference as well. If there's not access to health services, whether you're a student in school or whether you're a person who has been incarcerated or out in the community, whether you're able to, access them as adults, it makes a difference about on whether or not you also have more or less interactions with law enforcement. And of course, here in New Mexico, we have particular inequities in our Native American populations. Do you want to expound on anything else, Gary, on these issues before we move on? Maybe your experiences.
Yeah. Keep you moving along, doing well.
There was a letter, I'll just introduce, there was a letter that Gary and Therese Yannon of Native American Disability Law Center wrote and to the governor when she announced this council and the public health emergency that she had declared that racism was in the state. And so I just want to let Gary talk a little bit about what was in that letter. These are just some stats for you to look at. I think Gary can talk in more detail about the work that Disability Rights has done to address some of these issues.
Yes, thank you, Alice. We've devoted resources to really look at the school to jail pipeline issue. And in doing so, the statistics are undeniable. And in fact, the United States Commission on Civil Rights wrote a letter to President Trump in July 2019 to really emphasize these statistics nationally. So this is something that New Mexico's is not unique in. This is a national problem as far as Native Americans being subject to disparate treatment, Black students being subject to disparate treatment, students with disabilities with disparate treatment. Now, if you're a Black youth with a disability, then it's even worse. You're twice as likely as a white student with a disability to face harsher discipline, harsher suspension with it. So the thing to remember about this is, this is the first experience that young people are having with law enforcement quite often is in the school setting, and this is how they're being seen, and this is the result of it. And so it sets up a narrative for these young people to have a poor outlook on their future, their poor outlook on law enforcement, and the consequences that end up happening with it. So what we're trying to do is stop that pipeline. There's a saying, it says there comes a time when you need to stop just pulling people out of the river. You need to go upstream. And this is upstream for a lot of our kids of color and kids with disability. And that's why it is an intersection. And then you throw in gender with it too. All these things contribute to an unfair system with it. And so as you see the results, once they get on this path and this narrative, in this fiction, then the consequences are not good. They end up, getting disparate placement in detention centers and other places with it. So there are a number of things that intersect with law enforcement with it, and that is school resource officers and armed security personnel. There's a lot of thoughts that have gone on that the presence of school resource officers are in fact going to make the school safer, when really that's a fiction also. There's no studies that are showing that you really reduce violence in the schools by having the presence of school resource officers. There was a report that was just issued yesterday, in fact, in Massachusetts, on the subject of school police in Massachusetts, in which they gave it an F, in which there are fresh studies coming out to show that what ends up happening is once you start putting law enforcement in a position, and we see it later on when we start talking about community policing, you put personnel and resources that don't need to be there. And when you put those type of resources in there, here in the form of law enforcement, by default, they become too easily utilized to deal with situations in which other services, other resources, other professionals should be involved with. Instead, it becomes escalated with that. So that is one of the things that, and quite often the school resource officer in the school will be the triggering point that moves that young person on that path. And sometimes that can be stopped. Sometimes you can get a juvenile probation officer who will be able to look at that. And in New Mexico, we've had some success with juvenile probation officers recognizing this kid doesn't belong here. He doesn't belong in this criminal justice system. He needs services. He needs resources. And this is really a minor offense. And so quite often the juvenile probation officers will help try to get that kid out of that pipeline. But if he's going back into that school with the same school resource officers who have already looked at him or her with a certain way that of a limited value and future and categorize, it's going to get perpetuated. So as a lot of the community policing is looking at, this too needs to be looked at in the school to make sure that misuse of resources is avoided. Because as you find, when you have something there, it's going to be utilized, and they'll end up in the industry, with the utilization of the biases that are in place, it just sets it up for a bad outcome for the young person. And we know for these young people that are going to be suspended, expelled, it has tremendous consequences for them as they lose out on the educational experience and then try to assimilate back into the school. And I would just note, this is going to be a significant issue, particularly for Native American kids with disabilities who have been hit hard by COVID as they try to readjust into school. Are they going to be jettisoned out for really minor offenses? Will they have difficulties in adjusting and coming back? So the thing that's so important is have a consciousness too of that there is this bias that's being manifested in the school system, and by the utilization of law enforcement, you're really, pouring gasoline on that whole situation. So, we think this is an important policy that needs to be looked at. There's a national movement on it, on looking at how to, to not get law enforcement personnel in the schools to do that. Instead, it's all about resources. It's all about helping identify the disability. It's all about looking at a child in a way, because you're really creating a healthier, more educational, and a safer community for not only those students, but for the school personnel, when you have a better outlook on just making that school a more just school. And so those are the things, again, that we've seen. Restraint and seclusion has been something, again, that's been utilized that we know has disparate impact. The statistics are there. We know it's there. So how do we address that with it? And so that requires a consciousness, it requires a training, it requires a looking at those young people with a different lens than what they've had for so long. And that's the only way we can help kind of reverse that narrative. And so that's why it's so important as we deal with racial justice that we do look at the intersectionality of race, disability, gender, because ultimately what we're wanting is a more just society for people to be treated fairly so that they can achieve, and these kids are going to have a future. So we can move on a bit. Alice, unless you want to chime in, because I know you have some thoughts.
Doing DDPC includes, our education committee is looking at how we can work with public education department to completely revamp special education. This is very relevant to this issue because we know that many kids are being disciplined instead of receiving special education services for their disabilities. And we know that this is vastly disproportionately affecting our students of color, and particularly our Black and Indigenous students of color. And so working in special education and doing special education reform will go a long way to redirecting children who may enter the school to jail pipeline that Jerry has talked about, and instead funnel them toward resources that'll help them be the best students that they can be. And so it's really crucial that we do this work together. And one of the things that Amy asked us to consider presenting to the council are possible regulatory or legislative proposals that we can make. So one thing that we can do, and that I think is being done all over the country, is we can have legislation, state legislation here in New Mexico on restraint and seclusion. In fact, I've heard at least one of our legislators, I think she's here on the call. She can chime in later if she is, who has said that they will propose that kind of legislation in this upcoming session. So it's coming and it's important. We know that the use of restraint and seclusion is not only incredibly damaging permanently to a child, but we know that they are being used disproportionately again against students of color. And so, with this discipline issue, the restraint and seclusion really is a big part of it. So that's one way that we can work on legislation. And the other thing we can do is look at the regulations that public education department has put out for schools. So recently, actually in the last couple of months, there was a public comment period for a couple of regulations that the that PED put out, Public Education Department, for public comment. And one revision was on restraint seclusion. They didn't eliminate it. They just made some changes to make the process a little better, but better data, things like that, and a little bit stricter standard for schools to use restraint seclusion. However, again, I think the legislation is necessary. What they didn't touch was in that very same regulation, there are rules on how we have children, help them enter into special education and how we discipline children with disabilities. And the reason that our committee is not really calling it special education reform as much as reforming the way we educate students with disabilities is that so many students with disabilities never end up in special education. They end up instead in this disciplinary school to jail pipeline. So we're asking that the council consider looking at ways these regulations can be changed so that instead of disciplining children with disabilities, what we're doing is we are providing services instead and making the regulation more student service friendly. Another regulation that was up for public comment was the armed security personnel regulation. It's a brand new one, and it very broadly defines what an armed security personnel is. It does state specifically it's not a law enforcement person, but it also states specifically that it's a person who is a retired law enforcement officer who is able to carry a gun in school. And so again, these types of personnel in schools inevitably will result in more children, and specifically children of color and students of color, being targeted and ending up in a lifelong domino effect of run-ins with law enforcement rather than getting the services and help that they need. So I think both of us, Gary, you or me, can talk about this. These are some stats. I think it's worth going through these stats. I think this goes to the heart of why you asked us to come here today. And so, I just want to point out that we know that people with disabilities comprise between 1/3 to 1/2 of all individuals killed by law enforcement. We know that. That's a fact. And there's not a whole lot of data out there, but there are enough studies that show us it's a really, really big part of the population. So one of the things that we can do here in New Mexico is keep better data. Really see, how does disability intersect with race when it comes to any kind of interaction with law enforcement. And having this data will show us where we can cut off this kind of issue. And so there's many, Gary's talking upstream and downstream. There are so many places we can enter into the system, and we'll go through them as we talk about them. But it starts in education, and then after that, it starts with how we treat people with disabilities whenever there are interactions. How do we reduce those interactions? And then once folks are incarcerated, what happens there? And then for the folks that are released, what happens after what reentry services are available for them. Another stat that I think is worth considering is that people in state and federal prisons are nearly 3 times as likely to report having a disability and 4 times as likely to have a cognitive disability. So, we can, like intellectual disabilities, Down syndrome, autism, and other learning disorders. We also know that in schools as well, children with autism, mental and behavioral health, and learning disorders are disproportionately disciplined. And if you're a child of color or a student of color, I don't want to say child because at some point they're also young adults. So students of color who have these disabilities, there's, you know, in the lexicon of racial justice work, you know, we talk about, you know, double threats, triple threats. And so, you know, having that double threat of having a disability and being a student of color really does increase your chances of entering a lifelong system of law enforcement and incarceration, rather than getting services and being able to live your best life. People in jails are 4 times as likely to be disabled and 6 times as likely to have a cognitive disability. 1 in 5 prison inmates have a serious mental illness. And then particularly disturbing, you see many inmates with disabilities held in solitary confinement, which we know, having seen many studies about solitary confinement, how damaging it is to your mental health, how damaging it is to your life expectancy. Those inmates are being held in solitary confinement as an accommodation for their disability. So it's incredibly disturbing. Gary, do you have anything else you want to add in this?
No.
Slide of information.
No, except, I mean, the only thing is, again, the importance of identification. We know traumatic brain injury is one of those conditions that individuals will not be screened properly on, goes undetected, but yet it can certainly impact upon how they are treated in the criminal justice system, how they're able to even relate to their lawyer and their lawyer be able to represent them effectively. So there's the consequences that can happen, and because of those disabilities, really impairing the ability to effectively represent or be able to understand, so that the person will not end up having disparate treatment in the system.
That's right, Gary. And you know, like I said at the beginning, this is sort of just an introduction to talk about some overarching issues and to point out a few statistics that really illustrate the problems that we're looking at and the big obstacles that we're trying to solve. You know, there are so many more statistics we can give, especially around TBI, traumatic brain injury, and specific disabilities. And we hope that this will be an ongoing conversation for us as we do that. Gary, do you want to go ahead and take this slide and talk about some of these law enforcement issues that we've identified working together?
And I know we're really short on time, so I'll be quick, even especially for a lawyer.
I think this is the last slide, so I think we're
well, I think more and more as the dialogue's been going on nationally, people are starting to question really when should police be involved? What do we mean by community policing? How can we have a healthier and safer community for everyone? And I think part of that conversation leads to the conclusion, just like in school, reduce some of the interactions that police are currently involved with that they don't need to be involved with. They're not needed, and other professionals and other teams can be utilized that will effectively handle a situation. It is important, you know, of course, that everybody be safe, but it is certainly important to have the right professionals out there, because all the training in the world through crisis intervention or anything like that from a police officer still is not necessary and is not going to be as effective as a mental health professional that can go in. But just simply going in and de-escalating is just part of the solution. You know, you need resources, you need services, saying, okay, we've gone out there and seen Gary again, we've calmed them down, but you know, what is it we can do to help break this cycle and stop being called out on those things, but more importantly, improve the life for that individual. You know, seeing the situation and hearing the words involving Daniel Prude in Rochester, just, I mean, it's an example to me. I'll jump to the conclusion, there's no reason police need to be out there on that. And this man died terribly. And this was a situation with family members are calling for help for a person of color with a mental disability, and they're trusting that there's going to be an appropriate response made. And so until we have systems that are going to respond in a healthy way, in a trusting way, people are going to be reluctant to identify mental illness. We've got the huge stigma that's out there with that, starting in the school system. And for certainly as race gets added to it, then individuals are going to say, well, why in the heck do I want to have this label for this family member? Why do I want to have that? What will that really do? How will that really improve the life, as opposed to putting another category of a devalued life? So, there's so many things working against, particularly when race intersects with disability, that makes it even more challenging for us. But, we've got to, whether or not you call it, whatever you call it, it's about getting the right people, the right resources that are involved to help address the inequities. And inequities in services, inequities in the school system, inequities in housing, inequities in employment, all those things come into play that we have to try to deal with if we're going to have a just society. And so along with that, one of the things that I feel strongly about as far as another piece in the puzzle is reentry services. As people who have survived the criminal justice system, have paid their debt, now they're coming back, how do we help them rebuild their life and try to break down some of the barriers that were there in the beginning so that they can move forward and be able to be healthy and be able to have the opportunities that we want them to have, which means access to treatment, access to healthcare resources, all those things, driver's license, everything that's going to enable them to do that. So, there are good things that have occurred in Albuquerque from the court settlement, but there's so much work to be done. Of making available, the type of resources, mobile crisis units, and services that's going to help us make sure that we don't have the situations that happened to Mr. Boyd 6 years ago or 8 years ago. So that's what I would say, is that there's consistent themes here between school system and education and in our communities. Getting the right people involved, breaking down the biases and discriminatory treatment, and getting resources in there to deal with it, because it's a health issue, not a policing issue. So that's my final comments on that. Alice, did you want to add anything else?
I do. I just want to end very quickly. Do I have time?
Yeah, I just want to make sure we have room for council members to be able to ask questions of you all while we have you here.
Sure. Just very quickly, I just want to end with a personal story, because I think people don't, they often ask, why do you do this work? And I think this is really relevant. So I have, the issues that we're talking about, and specifically at the end, when we're talking about, what services are available, that's really the crux of the defund the police movement. And my personal story is that, I have a family member who struggles with a severe mental illness. And I'm a disability rights lawyer. I know about, the APD and what they've done with the crisis intervention units. I know all the training that we've done for police, and I don't want us to fall into the trap of, we just need to spend more money training police. I think we need to talk about what the services mean. So I've had to call the police on my family member because I had no other resource to go to. And because I knew about CIT and CIU, the crisis intervention, I knew what to expect, and, it went better for us. But I thought the whole time, what if this person, instead of 2 police officers, we got what research has shown has been much better, a mental health professional and a peer. Those are the folks that we need for these kinds of calls. And what if, at the end of, the whole interaction with the police, my family member was taken to UNM hospital. what if we empowered, these mobile crisis units to actually be a peer mental health professional who had a car who could drive you, that kind of thing. And so I just wanted to end with the fact that we do this work because it affects us personally, and we're really looking forward to working with the council or open to questions.
Thank you so much, Alice and Gary, really for expanding on the intersectionality of these issues, and also really inviting us to think about not just law enforcement and public safety, but education and health and so many other issues, really from margin to center as an approach. I just want to call out one question that was in the comment box about whether we can get a copy of the slide deck. I think
Yes.
Dr. Romero asked for that. Wonderful.
We can add more info to it too. This is, this was I don't like to put too much stuff in the slides while we're presenting, but we can put a lot more information in, and I'll send out the more comprehensive slides to the council if that's okay.
Thank you. You all shared some great information in the short time you had, so really appreciate that. I just want to open the floor for questions. If you have questions or points of discussion with Alice and Gary.
And let me remind people, right, that there are multiple ways for you to make sure if you have a question that you can be heard. You can raise your hand. That's the icon at the bottom of the participants. You can also put questions into the chat. If you're in our audience, you can also put questions into the Q&A. I believe that there will probably be more questions than we have time for. So if you see that your question is not going to have time to be answered, please put it into the chat so that we might communicate with Alice and Gary afterwards and get those answered. Thanks, y'all.
I see Dr. Romero asked, what would be your 1 or 2 recommendations for us to take forward? And so I was also going to ask, can you say more about, and I think Senator Lopez commented as well, more about the legislation to eliminate restraint and seclusion in schools, and anything else that would be your 1 or 2 things for us to consider?
Well, one of the things, I'm sorry, Dr. Romero, want to ask a question?
I was just going to maybe expand really quickly, and I want to thank you both for being here today. I'm a superintendent in Southern New Mexico, so I work on a daily basis with SROs. I work on a daily basis with our SPED population. I myself am a father of a student with special needs, or a child with special needs. And so I just wanted to see, based on everything you talked about, it was a lot of great information. What are the 1 or 2 things that you think we can take forward as part of the recommendations that would maybe I'm looking in 2 realms. One, what's a short-term help in these areas, and what's a longer-term solution that we think we can work on? Thank you.
Sure. I think, Dr. Romero, I think one of the things too is making sure we understand the scope of the problem, and that is getting good data as to how pervasive is discriminatory treatment of kids of color and kids with disability. So part of it might be juvenile probation officers be able to collect data about kids that are referred to them. How many of them had an IEP? How many have been identified as being with a disability, to just kind of be able to kind of know how prevalent this is in the numbers there, and to look at that way. So I think that's one of the areas to look at, is just collecting good data for us so that we can critically think, how much of a problem is this, and how can we reverse this, and what are some of the things that are lacking? And one of the things we're looking at, of course, and that's part of the Yazzie case too, is building the services up. We've got a lack of services out there. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't do a kid a parent any good if their IEP says you need these therapy services, but I'm sorry, there's none available, or there's not a social worker to help work with you. So part of this is, I've been in this stuff long enough. A lot of it is like building that infrastructure, the provider network, the services, so that we can address things instead of simply saying, well, this is wrong, but where are the services to kind of address the behavior issues so that we're making progress there. And I think, sometimes people are frustrated because there's nothing that can be gained there, or nothing can be secured. The other thing that I would mention, and that goes to the community policing, I see the other thing is Cahoots. That is a really good program out in Oregon. It's been out there for decades, about just sort of a system that really utilizes, and this is about community, about calls into a 911 system that really kind of triages those things and gets those calls directed, has that expertise, has the type questions that you need to ask on an intake system. So that's another challenge that you have. You've got someone calling in on 911, and you're trying to make a decision based upon what they're presenting in a crisis situation. So, and the situation may change by the time you get there. So Cahoots, I think, is a good model that's out there about how do you build into a system that right from the very end is a very good model that then employs critical thinking along with it to say, okay, we sent out this group on this situation, and this is the reasons why, and this is what we learned from it, so that we can have the best use of resources, because that's the critical juncture. Who do you send out to them in those situations? We've had the thing here with Miss Lucero that tragically died. I mean, it's people calling in crisis situations, and you're trying to decide what type of team needs to go out there with it. So I think those are the type of things to look at in all communities. Sometimes we're too Albuquerque-centric. All communities need to be looking at how they respond so that they have a healthier and safer community for everybody. But again, it's getting people available. You have crisis teams to be available 9 to 5. That doesn't help too much at night. You've got to have that available so that it can be a meaningful resource. I hope that was answered your question or some of the questions here. Thank you.
Alice, I think you're on mute.
I just want to add very quickly that one of the biggest problems that we see in the school setting is capturing the kids who need to get services. So we can put the services in place, but then we have to implement, the requirements and regulations that are already in place to make sure that kids are being identified. And a lot of this we have to bring more disability expertise to our educators, or else they won't be able to do that. There's very different ways that you deal with behavioral issues when you have a kid with autism versus having a kid with like PTSD. These are very different children with very different disabilities. And this same idea needs to be brought across all different areas of law enforcement out, once you're out of school and you're out in the community and you're an adult, do we have disability expertise when we have crisis situations out in the community? So like, the Cahoots program that you were discussing and that Gary talked about, that's one way. It's a really great model. And so I think as far as recommendations going forward, we really do need to make sure that there's a recommendation coming from the council telling the state of New Mexico, you have to figure out special education and how that captures students, especially students of color, who are caught in this school to jail pipeline trap. So that's one big, umbrella recommendation. Another one is, of course, not only building out the services for crisis situations and not only having that kind of initial interface where we're able to provide different services depending on what your issue is, but making sure that there is disability expertise to deal with different kinds of disabilities. Otherwise, we won't be able to put people where we need. Even if we built out services all day and we had perfect services, unless we knew how to connect people with those services, unless we take the underlying institutional racism and other kinds of biases out of that decision-making process, we won't be able to utilize those services well. So those are my general recommendations. We have more specific ones as well for later conversations.
Thank you both so much, Alex and Gary. I want to make sure I did not miss anyone's question or hand raised that had a question. Yes, Darshan.
Hi, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. So as a former high school math teacher, I remember in crisis situations in schools, often the resource officer was kind of the de facto kind of police officer in a school that would show up. And that's the help you had as a teacher when you needed help in those types of situations. And so I think, I know in the law enforcement setting, we're talking a little bit about the idea of moving funds away from kind of armed police into police aides or other unarmed people showing up to crisis situations. Is there space, in your opinion, in the New Mexico education budget to like move funds? Because it seems like there's not really, a surplus, and the likelihood of getting more funds is limited. So is that type of thinking in the way we're thinking about potentially reorganizing the budget for APD potentially, is that something that we can think about in terms of school budgets? Like, how do we take money that would be funding more kind of police-oriented work in a school toward more, of these kind of disability support services?
So that's a really tricky question, and I'll just very generally say that funding is very tricky when it comes to education, because specifically for special education, we still don't have accurate data over how much money is specifically dedicated to special education, for example. And so unless you can make those delineations, where how funding is spent and where it's being allocated, and whether or not it's being spent where it's allocated, if that makes sense. Unless you can make those distinctions and keep very accurate data about what's happening there, it's hard to move around resources, if that makes sense. And so one of the biggest things that needs to happen, as Gary was saying, is we have to have better data about not only what's happening to kids, but how funding is being allocated towards services for kids, and what's being prioritized.
Yeah, Mr. Patel, I think it's a good question. Part of it is kind of deconstructing sort of the narrative or perhaps even a fiction for some degree as to the role of police or school resource officers, because it can end up being one difficult to let go of. And so I think there's a lot of good studies out there, a lot of good things looking at when our school resource officers really involved and engaged in. How many times were they really necessary to be involved in, to be able to kind of critically, again, look at, we didn't really need a school resource officer to do that. There was maybe a good outcome, sometimes not a good outcome, but there was a good outcome on some of them. But I think it's just like it is about looking at police in our community. Can we think about reimagining the role of police, role of school resource officers, and how to respond to situations and behavior situations in particular? But the money thing is difficult. It's sort of like we're not ready to let go of some things, or let's completely move all those funds over to another area, and people feel a sense of nervousness about that, about what's going to happen. And the funding on it, particularly with regards to kids with disability, is a tricky one also, because we're wanting to make sure the dollars are going for these kids and for services too. So it's a good question, because it always boils down to funding. Even here in Albuquerque, when they're looking at the community safety program, where's the money for that? What impact's that going to have? You've got other things going on with some other groups that are doing some things Are we building on something? Are we displacing something? And where's the money going to come from? But the dollar question is always an important one. But another important one is just what is the lens we look at things? And I think it comes a time where we have to kind of rethink how we're addressing a problem or addressing a situation. I hate to call it a problem, but address a need. Because teachers like you're looking for something. How can you be equipped? How can you have the resources? Who can help you be able to meet the needs of that child and your classroom so that's a productive thing? There was an interesting thing called discrete theory. I'll send it to people if they're interested in it, but it's a whole different view by teachers, and it starts with the teachers when they're in college as far as getting prepared to go into school, of how they look at the school setting, how they look at the students in it, to make sure that you are not categorizing kids that are how do you categorize white kids without disability compared to non-white kids and kids with disabilities? And it's changing how you look at things. And to hear the teachers talk about in the studies about what a difference it made, and how they looked at their experience as teachers, and how they looked at the school as a space now that they're sharing with these students. So I'll send that, if people are interested, I'll send it to you, Alexandria and Amy, if anybody's interested in that article.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think any additional resources that you would like for us to share with the council, if you'll send them to Amy, and we can distribute those. This is really important information. And thank you for that question, Dr. Patel. I want to also be mindful of Alice and Gary's time. And so, Janine, I do see your hand. If we can take one more question, is that okay?
And I see one in the chat as well. So.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. I'm so sorry. Forgive my ignorance because I also joined late. But I was wondering if there was, I had like 3 questions. I was wondering if there was in consideration of any data or studies, and if any have been done in the state in general, looking at the pattern of labeling students of color with disabilities when it's other cognitive or other behavioral problems rooted in something else. I know that we have seen, at least in our reservations, a lot of cases of mislabeling students with disabilities brought to our attention as parents. I used to work with us on school boards and on parent committees. The other one is, what about, and it's similar to what Christopher's asking, actually, what about exploring also creating an environment of inclusion through developing meaningful curriculum that does have race theory, that does have, like a culturally relevant curriculum for the students in order to make the entire school system more enriching and more empowering and inclusion, foster more inclusion for students. And then the third, there's a couple of times that some of the language didn't sit well with me in terms of like calling disability and being born with disabilities and a person of color as a double threat. And I think that part of what we're learning both as a council and as individuals who are navigating very complex social dynamics right now is that we have to be very careful of our language and ensure that we're not labeling the characteristics that are leading to outright systemic oppression, our manifestations of that against vulnerable peoples as a problem that people are born into, but rather, reframing that and naming what the source of the problem is, and that, the source is white supremacy, and systems of white supremacy existing and embedded into our school systems make these students more vulnerable, and they're not the threat. And I know that that was not what was being meant or being communicated, but just how that's why it's so important for us to have that consciousness around the language that we use and how we're presenting these findings.
Thank you, Janine. And I think you're right about the language. And I think, when people hear that, they don't necessarily hear what that term is supposed to mean. When we say threat, we're talking about threat to the person living with the disability, the person who has, who is of a particular race. So the threat is against them, like to them, right? But when we hear that term, we don't necessarily think of that. We think of them as being a threat. So yeah, I totally see where you're coming from, and you're right. Reframing the language is a really big deal. I think Gary can speak some more to this, but I know that Disability Rights New Mexico works very closely with Native American Disability Law Center. They're both protection and advocacy agencies here in New Mexico. And to give you a broader perspective of how we all work together, the enabling statute for protection and advocacy organizations is the same statute that enables my organization, the Developmental Disabilities Council. So in every state in New Mexico, there are protection advocacy groups like Disability Rights in Mexico, and there are DD councils like my council. And part of what we need to do, and the reason we have a specific one here in New Mexico for Native American disabilities is because, as you said, there are very unique challenges that we're looking at. We're looking at our indigenous populations. And so I think we can bring in Therese, right, Gary, for some of this information. To my knowledge, there hasn't been an official, at least, study done by the state looking at this kind of these kinds of statistics. And so, you know, and a recommendation from this council could be that we need to have a study, have better data around, you know, discipline in schools, around students with disabilities and students of Indigenous and Black populations. We need to have better data on those law enforcement interactions as well in the community once they become adults. Gary, do you have more to add on that?
Just very quickly, Ms. Yazzie, the question, I think, if I understand correctly, I've read a couple different studies, both on opposite spectrums. One says over-identification of individuals of color with disability, and that there's overdiagnosis. Another one is under-identified. So they're over this. The studies seen nationally are on both sides of the spectrum. I tend to think that there's just from my experience of over 40 years, that the stigma still exists, and the experiences from representing individuals is ones in which parents have been told, you're just a bad parent or you've got a bad kid, that this isn't, and the mental health stigma still is strong out there, such that individuals are not identified. And then we have a problem in New Mexico with a slow process for people to be evaluated and identified. So there's those delays that go on, which delays in the educational supports that are needed for it. But you know, the short answer to your question is there are no studies that I'm aware of in New Mexico, but I do think that you know, it's a mixed opinion out there about over or under identification.
Yeah.
And I think Janine also put in the chat that, and that's why I started, and actually this goes to your point, Janine, we started this presentation with a quote from what is her first name? From Ms. Thompson. She was the creator of the hashtag Disability So White. And the issue that we see over and over again with intersectionality is that when we have advocacy groups formulating around specific issues, and we don't bring race issues and the racial lens into it, we don't bring diversity into the different perspectives, and we don't bring racism and white supremacy into those conversations, when we build those movements, we always end up silencing people and making people invisible. So I really appreciate that you brought that perspective to us, and for us to reiterate it again. I mean, that's why we had to start the conversation with her, and her statement that I'm a person who is Black and I'm a person who has disabilities. And whenever I work in either of those spaces, people want me to just be one or the other, but I'm both. And I have to be recognized as both in the work that I do.
Yeah, thank you both, Alice and Gary, so very much. I think also this underscores that this is just the start of a conversation here. You all have been having the conversation and it's been happening much longer, but for the council here, these are just the start of conversations, right? And as we continue our longer term planning, much more space and to continue these conversations. And so if you'll send Amy information that you have to share with the council, and if there are additional questions, we can also send those through Amy back to Alice and Gary. And we look forward to working with you going forward. And thank you so much for being here today. All right. So now we're going to move to report outs of subcommittees. If we want to start with education.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Alice, and also Gary. That was a great segment. I enjoyed listening to it. Very educational. So we met last Thursday, which was on the 17th. Our guest speaker was Senator Lopez. We had talked about the bill that she had proposed and how we are going to analyze it and see what we can come up with to help that move through, even on the Senate in January, or propose that anyway. We are going to have on October 1st, which will be our next meeting, we are going to have from PED, Allison Briencio, I probably really wrecked her name, and she's going to speak on the Education Act. We also are going to have Rebecca Reyes to assist her with helping her. After that, we are going to, on the 15th, have guest speaker John Bingaman, and also Secretary Ryan Stewart, I believe. I don't know if we confirm that yet, but that is our request. And that is going to be speaking on the federal impact legislation. So I believe you had asked of our committee if we had the communications agreement, which is with our particular committee. Yes, Alexandra, I do know that you had asked, did we agree to record that? And yes, we do have recordings of both. I believe Amy has one. I think she was having a little bit of difficulty getting the other one downloaded, but we'll get those out. However you decide to put those on a public YouTube, I believe. Also, during our last meeting, as Senator Lopez reported to us, she was just reporting to us her anti-racism bill and some of the areas that we can focus on and maybe help assist in with getting that resubmitted this next session. And I believe that is it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I believe so. And also our next meeting, like I said, is going to be on the 1st of October. If anybody would like an invite, certainly just shoot me an email. I'll put my email in the chat and I can certainly send you the link.
Thank you so much, Tammy. Amy, to Mikhail's question at the start of the meeting, where will the subcommittee videos be posted? At the same link as this committee's?
Yes, they're posted on that same YouTube link, and I'll continue to send that out regularly.
Thank you. Thank you for that report out, Tammy, on the Education Committee. And now we'll move to Public Safety and Law Enforcement.
Hi, everyone. So we also had our last meeting last Thursday. We met with Deputy Secretary Kelly Hamilton with the Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Management. And he gave us a presentation on the 1033 Act, and we got to ask a lot of informative questions, we being the subcommittee, not myself. We also got a report back from Deputy Secretary Hamilton with that 1033 info, kind of a historical report, breakdown by county and law enforcement agency, what kind of equipment has gone out, etc. As soon I'll work with Amy, but I think as soon as the subcommittee gets to review, I don't know, we can probably send it out to the full council as well. There was some good discussion there about making that information publicly available for the entire state as well. Our next meeting is going to be October 1st, and we are actually doing a joint committee meeting with the Health Subcommittee, and we'll be meeting with Director Alzaharna from Department of Public Safety, who is like in head of the Law Enforcement Training Academy. So we'll be covering several different topics there. I do have them up. Let me pull them. Wait, I think I have the right names. I might not. I might have said. Okay, I got lost. Director Alzaharna is meeting with us on October 15th. That is not with the Health Subcommittee. Next week with the Health Subcommittee is going to be Secretary Tafoya Lucero of the Corrections Department, and that will be a combined. I'm sorry, I've been doing stuff for the council all day, and there's a lot of moving pieces. So next week, in combination with the Health Subcommittee, we're going to be looking at health facilities management in state prisons, training requirements and hiring practices, any mandated legislation and statute tied to those areas. We'll be looking into transgender pods, the authority that the state has over county jails and detention centers, and hearing about healthcare for incarcerated people and co-pays. So that's coming down the pipeline for the 1st, and on the 15th, we will meet with Director Alzaharna, and that's because I have the wrong date there. And that's what we're going on. And our subcommittee also kind of narrowed in on 3 priorities that they want to continue to look at. And I'm sure that after the discussion today, there might be more to add to that, but the committee has decided to focus on recruitment, training, and education for state police. The second being the 1033 Act, and the third looking at prisons. And as far as the recording goes, because we might have presentations that will have people sharing like personal information, we thought that if they knew that they were going to be broadcasted online, that would kind of like change the tone of what presenters might have to say. So we agreed that we will just give really detailed reports to the full council and make that information available that way. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Shani. And then health.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. So last week, the Health Council, the Health Subcommittee met, and we had a presentation by the Department of Workforce Solutions Secretary Bill McCamley. He kind of gave us an overview of the department's work right now, and then just talking about unemployment benefits, and there was no unemployment benefits, and then looking into kind of their apprenticeship program that is trying to ramp up again and getting people into apprenticeship. So really looking at the workforce breakdown of where there's need for more people, and identified places when they're working with the higher education department. But basically in the trades, it's very gendered. 90% of the people in the state of New Mexico are males who are in the apprenticeship program right now, and some of it is due just to the trades that are in the Department of Workforce Solutions, are typical traditional male dominated fields, carpentry, electricians, things like that, and areas that they need help in and need more jobs and people to get trained is in the trades, healthcare, education, STEM, and IT. Also, along with the apprenticeship program, there was questions asked from subcommittee members about how do we get more people to know about these programs and understand how to get high schoolers involved in these programs instead of just a military or a college track. We also discussed a little bit about some of the prisoner reentry programs that the Department of Workforce Solutions has done. So there was a couple of issues, a couple of programs they had on there, training some of people to be construction workers and get some skill set after they get out of jail. And then also the Department of Workforce Solutions oversees the New Mexico Human Rights Bureau. So it's a place where people in the state can go to, to file a claim of discrimination. Secretary McCamley really just kind of let us know that's where that department is housed, that bureau, and a lot of times those claims are duly filed at the US EEOC. Other than those topics, there's just more interest in how do we get people of color, more female people into who identify as female, into not to conform to these gender roles in the apprenticeship program. Communication agreements that came out of the health subcommittee were to post our meetings on the YouTube channel. So that is already up there if anybody has seen or looked at the channel site. We have decided that, people, I'll be giving the report outs, doing that now. So for the subcommittee, and that we'll move to a kind of we'll have a majority consensus vote, but if there's a modified consensus. So if there's an issue that people are not comfortable recommending to the main council as a topic area, that we will try to figure out what best way to come to consensus on things. One suggestion was having maybe a time limit to discuss things and then seeing whether or not people are comfortable moving on suggestions to the main council from there. So next, as Shani mentioned, our next meeting is next Thursday from 4 to 6. So the folks on the public or the law enforcement committee are going to be joining the health subcommittee's meeting from 4 to 6 p.m. and having that presentation by the corrections department secretary. Really the subcommittee is interested in healthcare provided for prisoners and looking at the co-pays. We know that they're really high and it may deter people from going to get care while in custody. I think that pretty much wraps it up. And into the future, we're going to be looking at try to get some speakers for to discuss addiction and substance abuse issues. So possibly Neil Bowen's team and him and whoever from his staff may be available to present. So
thank you. Thank you so much, Kaylee. And just wanted to briefly open the floor for any questions or comments that folks had for either Tammy, Shani, or Kaylee regarding the 3 subcommittees' work. And thank you for those who were able to attend or chose to attend. Oh, yes. Marion.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hey, awesome. Kaylee, I was just wondering on the health committee, is there any topics around embarking the issue of paid sick leave? As you all know, paid sick leave is super essential under a public health emergency and should be also a priority when we're talking about workers' health in the workforce, especially as we're having essential workers, quote unquote, and yet we don't have access to paid sick leave, and those tend to be workers of color, minority workers, and so I think that's an issue that we should definitely be moving forward within the health committee.
Yes, so thanks for that reminder. We did discuss having that discussion. We don't have anything planned at this moment, but there is interest from the subcommittee to have that conversation. And then also Austin had mentioned last time the Lovelace Women's Hospital separating newborns from their mothers. There's a report, or there is an investigation by the governor's office, and we're going to be working with Jane Wishner from the governor's office to hopefully see a rendition in that report. So thanks for bringing that up, but they were both brought back to the subcommittee from your suggestions last meeting. There's no set presentation yet, but it has been discussed.
Perfect. I'm also able to share with you all some research reports that came out on paid sick leave, on workers that are essential yet excluded of financial aid, of economic relief. So I'm able to share those research reports with you all so that you could have that as you're moving forward with any recommendations on paid sick leave.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Marion. It's also on the list that I am keeping of legislation and priorities that we as the Central Committee may want to invite speakers. I know there's the Paid Medical and Family Leave Coalition that's been working on this issue. And so it may be an issue that we prioritize also hearing here at the council directly about as we start to work on those short-term priorities. Fatima?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for all the presentations and updates. This question is for Shani. Thank you for such a thorough update, and I'm really looking forward to seeing the 1033 data. And I'm just reflecting on the presentation from Alice and Gary and wondering where the alternatives to policing conversation falls in terms of just your opinion and based off of this subcommittee and alternatives to policing. By that I mean behavioral health services, diversion, using 911 or 211 or 311 to divert calls away from police and armed responses to crisis response. And does that I guess it's a question for both health and the law enforcement subcommittees, where does that fit in the priorities and the conversation you all have had so far? Has that been part of that, or just kind of wanting to check in about that?
It's definitely been part of the conversation for public safety and law enforcement. I feel like some of those questions are going to be brought up in the next two subcommittee meetings that are coming up to kind of talk about if it's feasible, what would it look like, and how could it happen. I do think that it's still definitely a priority for our subcommittee. I don't know that we have a discussion dedicated to it now. I know that it's come up multiple times and that people are concerned about, so how do we redirect funding? So it has come up, and I believe that they will be coming up with suggestions, just not right.
Yeah, and for the health subcommittee, it's something we're looking to get scheduled just to learn more about for the subcommittee of what resources are dedicated where, and if there's any way you can see that the data, there's more behavioral health resources dedicated to certain areas or certain hospitals, and what that looks like under the state purview.
Thank you. And Margaret, I see your question about the status of the use of the land grant permanent fund. I believe that has come up on every subcommittee. And one of the actions I'm going to ask us to take today is to consider us having a presentation here at the main council regarding that, as that is an active upcoming legislative bill that I think we should act on and hear from in the near future. All right. Thank you so much, Tammy, Shani, and Kaylee. I appreciate that. And thank you all for your questions and this enriching discussion. The last plan on our agenda was to have a conversation about law enforcement discussion. It was kind of general, but we talked about really as we continue to develop and think about those longer term goals and racial justice impact stances, we also want to really start working on our priorities to make our recommendations for the upcoming legislative session. And so we wanted to spend some time today around the information we heard from Alice and Gary, as well as considering some of the priorities addressing law enforcement related issues and public safety issues that we're aware of, and to think about what additional information that we need. And so a few things that are have been brought to our attention that we would like to bring folks in to present on. Relevant to me today, I just asked this question heading into this meeting, is to look at the use of no-knock warrants in New Mexico. I don't know that that's on anyone's priority list, but it's certainly top of my mind today. Last week on September 14th, the Courts, Correction, and Justice Committee, the law enforcement use of force, reporting on deadly use of force and investigations, which Senator Cedillo Lopez, Representative Patricia Roybal Caballero, and I have Senator Antoinette Cedillo Lopez on here twice, so I don't know who the third person is. But that is one of the bills that is being presented in the interim to be introduced in session that we can invite them here to talk about, as well as the law enforcement training legislation that is, or memoriam that is being developed by Representative Gail Chasey, Representative Day Hockman Vigil, and Senator Antoinette Cedillo Lopez. So just wanted to open discussion specific to law enforcement and public safety about the short-term priorities and who we would like to hear from really at the next meeting, so that we can begin setting that list of what our recommendations for the legislative session are going to be. And also just any comments and feedback or prioritization that came from today's presentation as well. And recognizing this, we're at 5:37, so we'll keep this, it's going to be about a 15-minute conversation, so it can be moved forward. Anybody? Or are you just sitting on it? Oh, Rabbi Lennick.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, everybody. With the events of the past week, we see the scales on a daily basis tipping against racial justice in this country. And, I was interested in being on this council because I felt that we would have a role to play in being part of the tipping point in changing that direction, and that New Mexico would play a leadership role in setting the tone of how to achieve a tipping point to bring about change. And that's why I think the law enforcement question, my perspective is, just after the verdict that was announced today and all the dozens and dozens of examples of injustice perpetrated against people of color, the Black community, just across the board, I think the issue of law enforcement should be our #1 priority. I really do. I think it is symbolically important. I think it's systemically important. I mean, listening to Alice and Gary, you can't help but even more deeply understand how systemic these issues are. And they're systemic from birth. So I would like to see our committee look at, through whatever means is possible, for example, what portion of law enforcement expenditures are on the militarization of the police. And I would like to see those funds through legislation redirected to support the expansion of other types of interventionalists who can address on-site situations with other than weapons and the display of force. So I'm being very specific, but I want to see our group start to really do something that will go to the heart of the problem. We know there's healthcare is another issue. We know education is another issue. But, and there are layers of these issues. But I, for one, would vote for us to focus deeply, both short-term and long-term, on the subject of law enforcement. Thanks.
Alexandria, you're muted.
Thank you. Mr. Cotton, and I said thank you, Rabbi.
Okay, thank you. And I have to say, I really appreciate your introduction because what has taken place today should affect us all in one way or the other. And Rabbi, I can't help but agree with you even more. I'm really passionate because it's sad that a life could be lost in America in 2020, and we have no one to fault for it. We can't say who's at fault, but in New Mexico, we've been given a charge to try to make a difference. And everything that Gary and Alice and the school resources, they put my mind in a different mindset. When I look at school resource officers, I need to think of that differently. But everything that every committee, all these things are so important to racial justice or racial injustice plays a part. But the core of our issue is law enforcement. And there has to be something that we can say, hey, we're making a difference. This is what we're gonna do in New Mexico, dealing with law enforcement. And I know some people think individual communities. I've talked to my community here, community leaders here. I know what we could change when it comes to community policing or policies that we have in place that we could add to the charter to hold law enforcement officers accountable. But when I read that out of the state, the only continued training required by the state, only 2 hours are devoted to hate crimes, and none are directly devoted to biased policing or racism. We have a problem that we should have. That should be somewhere, and maybe we should bring someone in to explain this or talk to us about it. Maybe I'm misreading, and it said only 2 hours are devoted to interaction with persons with mental impairment. So the state is not even requiring bias training longer, and 2 hours biannually, and that's not enough training. So yes, we do need to get to the core of it. We do need to get to the meat of it. We do need to have this real hard conversation because we need to be making some changes on what the state requires for counties and law enforcement. So I'm passionate when it starts, until we fix what people are dealing with every day in New Mexico and America and start addressing that issue. We got to get there. So that's my little take on it. And I agree with the rabbi on that's where we need to be. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cotton. Any other? Yeah, Mikhail.
So I just want to say I completely agree with both of you on everything that you just said. I think it's important to focus on demilitarization of the police and redistributing the funds, but I think it's also important to realize that there's still new legislation being put in place that are that are hurting exactly what we're fighting for, state and federal. You see with the Trump administration right now, they're still trying to take away federal race-related trainings. And on the state level, you see small things being put in place that are also say we go to a protest. There's a protest on Friday for the verdict on Breonna Taylor's case, and nobody at that protest is allowed to open carry, and police are allowed to come in, and if they have the thought that somebody might be carrying a weapon, are able to arrest them for nothing. And I think that these things being put into place are just as important to focus on, because if we're fighting against things only that have been in place in the past, but still letting them put things into place that are hurting us now and in the future, I just think it's just as important to do that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mikhail. Looking, Councilwoman Bacomo.
Thank you, Alex, and thanks everyone for has spoken. Rabbi, thank you so much for those words. That was really powerful. Absolutely agree with you. I also, this is it does turn out that this is something that we really want to make a priority, which I definitely agree we should. I, for one, would love, we keep talking about rediverting funds. We don't really, though, I mean, at least I don't understand even where those funds are being used right now at the state level. I brought this up 2 weeks ago in terms of the budget, often people, I love talking about budgets, but budgets aren't sexy. People don't like to talk about them. But it's incredibly important to talk, to understand, budgets are moral documents that tell the world who and what we value. And I, for one, want to understand how New Mexico budgets money for anything related to public safety, for sure, policing, surveillance technology, incarceration, detention centers, anything that relates to policing and public safety. I want to know how much money New Mexico currently spends, and then compare that to how much money it spends on behavioral health, how much money it spends on diversion programs, on programs that get people into rehabilitation, and those kinds of things, right? And so we can have a solid analysis of what we mean when we say divert funds from what into what. And I think we need to first understand how our money is being spent right now, to really, I think, oppress and scare a lot of the most vulnerable folks in our community.
Thank you for that. And I have note of you mentioning that last week, and I think we can work. Thank you, Jennifer, for dropping that link in of the executive budget. And I think we can work to figure out when we can have a presentation on that and really deep dive into that. I think really important is us taking a really intersectional and holistic look at this. And so I want to give Dr. Patel, I saw your hand up. I want to give you a moment to speak. And then I would like to ask that we reach an agreement around whether we want to take Rabbi Lennox's suggestion that we make public safety and law enforcement one of our first priorities, so we can leave this meeting with a priority and really start thinking about what this council hears and learns from. My learning today from Alice and Gary just opened up so many things across all the intersections. I'm a bit emotional about it, actually. And that way we can start really prioritizing and thinking about what the subcommittees are going to hear from and who we're going to hear from to reach these decisions. And so, Dr. Patel.
Thank you. I guess my question was about process, which you were talking about briefly, and I agree. I think law enforcement should be a priority. I'm wondering, if we together agree that that is the priority today, is that going to be a conversation we prioritize having in the subcommittees, and then we kind of, as an executive committee or council members, show up to those meetings to support? Or if we, elect that that's going to be our priority, kind of how are we going to create either a report, or is there going to be a meeting, maybe the next one, where we as a council decide this is our recommendation to the governor? I'm just trying to figure out, and that's just in relation to this law enforcement issue, about how we kind of can work best with the subcommittees, or if other people on the executive committee have worked with the subcommittees in a way that they feel like is kind of productive in moving things forward, that would be great to know too. But I think that process can help us maybe take some of this energy and these ideas that have been brought up, and maybe kind of either put it down on paper or think about what a final report or something like that would look like.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Amy, do you want to speak to that at all?
Yeah, I think so. The Public Safety and Law Enforcement Committee is very, very focused on law enforcement and already has some really great ideas down. And so if you all want to follow that, I mean, again, we will always send out the invites and the agendas to you. We're working on bringing in speakers about all of the different multiple things that have been put forward in the list that you all put out, as well as brainstorming that has happened in the subcommittee. And so I think I'm really excited about you all saying law enforcement would be a priority, but I think you got to dig down even closer so that we then can really figure out who to bring in. One of the things you'll have to remember is that, you know, when you say law enforcement, there's local law enforcement agencies, which we do not have influence over, and then there is the state police. And so when you're asking for things like budgets or rules that we might do, we're going, I mean, and already we have, we're looking at Secretary Shea and also Chief of Police Johnson and coming into the subcommittees. And so if you have very specific asks, we can ask them for that and get that information. You know, I'm looking here in the chat, and one of the things says checkpoints in Gallup. We do not have influence over the Gallup law enforcement, so we would not be able to do that. We can certainly request it, and definitely there is power in the Governor's Advisory Council requesting that information, but you know, we don't have influence over that. So I guess what I'm asking is, if you want the subcommittee to look at something that they're not already looking at, we just need it to be a little bit more specific so that we can start talking about who to bring in. What we have been doing is, when we're hearing suggestions that are coming out of multiple subcommittees, or if they're coming out of subcommittees and the council, we're shooting that up to the council as a whole as something that you all should be listening to, and that those are the presentations that you all should be listening to, because it's coming out of so many different places.
Yeah, thank you for that, Amy. And I'll add, I think, so moving forward, one of the things we're going to be trying to do is really kind of do that 2-track in our meetings, right? Which is why next week I would like to kind of short-term look at what is kind of already on the table that is being asked for us to be presented to us, and for us to be able to ask questions to really determine if that's something the council wants to recommend, and then continuing to invite in speakers like today that come from issues that are arising from the 3 councils, even though they might not yet be one of their recommendations. Today, Alice and Gary, and prior to today, they had sent us very specific things that we could support, and I would like to add to that list of what we hear from as the main council from Senator Lopez and the bill that they mentioned regarding restraints and that they're working on. And so really kind of starting to 2-track this and figuring out what makes it on to kind of our longer term planning beyond just this upcoming legislative session, but also taking action. And so by saying today that we really want to focus on law enforcement, that is certainly not the only priority, right? We're going to continue. I think even out of today, we've got some ideas for education and health priorities, and just really continuing to work together as all 4 committees are starting to kind of really gain their feet and figure out how this process is working. So do we have agreement to prioritize law enforcement as it's related today, and to hear from those who are carrying state legislation at our next meeting? Just show a thumbs up. Is there dissent from that, if that we're not okay with that moving forward, or with law enforcement being the priority? Or is there dissent from that we want to hear from?
I just have a question. Sorry, someone was speaking first.
Go ahead, Janine.
Yeah, so just going back to what Amy said, so if we're saying law enforcement, which to me, I was thinking about all law enforcement in the state, to only mean state police, is that what we're talking about then? The focus is only going to be on state police? Because then I think we need to be precise with our language.
So, I mean, you know,
I'm sorry.
If what you're suggesting is legislation, then the legislation needs to be suggested in a way that it would be passed for all law enforcement agencies. I think a really great example, and probably one that folks want to look at, is the cameras, the body cameras legislation that happened last year, that has been in the news this week about the mandate and how law enforcement is or is not following that mandate. That is something that this council can suggest. But if you're asking is for us to go in and ask for their budgets or things like that, that can only be requested, because we don't have access to their stuff unless it's public information. And so if you're asking for things specifically for presentations and for data and that kind of stuff, the state police would be where we can get that. And particularly if what the suggestion is to ask for a rule to be put down, the rules would have to be just over state police.
If I may,
yes.
What we have, okay, what we have control over at state level, as Amy just mentioned, is the state police. However, through the academy is where the training happens, and the oversight that happens for both state police, municipal, and of course our sheriffs, the deputies. So that's where we have the effect training and like the continuing education that has to happen. That is where we have per se over that. Anything dealing with local law enforcement, that has to go through the municipalities, the mayors, county commission. That's where there's more purview over specific direct interaction on budgets and such with regards to the police effort. But anything that we have passed during session, we have several laws that are coming up, and maybe through the Courts and Corrections Justice Committee, Alexandria, we can get more of a list. I'll look for it and see what we can get specifically so that maybe the legislation can be brought to our council, so at least we can review it and see what's being talked about for the 60-day session that's coming up. Because my suspicion is that there are many legislators out there who are also working on legislation, and they're not even, we're not connected at some point. So if I may, Alexandria and team, I'll do some inquiry this week and see what else I can find in there too, and then share it, just so that our subcommittee can work on that too. That way we're not doing the crosshairs, because that, so we can work on that, make our recommendation to the governor, and then that other magical thing can happen as we get into January, which means we still got work to do after January starts.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Senator Lopez. I think that would be really helpful and greatly appreciated.
Okay.
I think one of the things, yes, Jacqueline, we're hoping for 3 to 4 priorities as a council, or I'm sorry, yeah, Jacqueline, 3 to 4 priorities as a council at this time, and really, really wanting to kind of move these recommendations for the legislative session forward so that we can then begin looking more holistically at the longer range goals of the council and really looking at these issues from a well-rounded view and really going deeper in that way. So thank you all for your time today. We have much to let resonate and think about moving forward. And again, resources, sharing, agenda items, if you will send that to Amy, and if you're able to participate in any of or attend as a guest any of the subcommittee meetings, they are very informative. And it really is starting to take shape around how all of us are working together in this process. And so really appreciate your time today. Take care of yourself, be gentle with yourself, and tell the people you love that you love them. Yeah. Thank you all so much. I appreciate you.
Can I actually
Thank you.
Can I actually keep everybody for a second?
Yeah.
So on October 2nd, I know it's really short notice, but I'm holding a voters registration rally at Roosevelt Park, in downtown Albuquerque by the hospital. And we're kind of having like a Black cultural celebration to get people to come. We're having local Black vendors, Black-owned restaurants, and Black entertainers singers, rappers that are local. And I was just going to say, I'll drop my phone number in the chat. If anybody has any way they think they would like to like contribute or help with it, or would like to come speak on why it's so important to vote, the flyer is getting is almost done. My co-president with BSU is finishing it up right now. So if I could send that to Mrs. Whitfield or Mrs. Taylor, and if you could send that out to everybody, that would be really appreciated. But I would just appreciate it if everybody could kind of advertise for it a little bit. And yeah.
Great stuff. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, send that to Amy. And thank you for being here today. I see lots of people asking if you have a flyer. So yeah, send that on and folks will create that echo chamber for you. Thanks so much. All right, you all be well. Thank you.